Hey, movie nerds! Today we're stepping into Aguila, a 1980 epic drama that explores the tangled weave of personal destiny and a nation's turbulent history, a story that asks us to look deeper, to question, and to feel beyond the surface. I'm glad you're here because together we'll unravel the hidden layers, the subtle details, and the little moments that whisper the heart of the film. If you haven't yet, go ahead and subscribe. Let's keep exploring these stories that shape how we see the world. Now settle in, open your mind, and let's dive into the depths of this cinematic journey. Some films feel like snapshots in time. This one feels like a living, breathing chronicle. It doesn't simply tell the tale of one man. It threads his journey through the collective memory of a country struggling to define itself. It stretches across decades, allowing us to witness the transformations not only of its central figure, but of the landscapes, the politics, and the people who surround him. Every sequence feels weighted with the residue of history, as if the film itself were etched onto the fabric of the nation's conscience. This isn't the kind of story you watch for quick thrills. It's one you experience like the reading of a cherished family history, equal parts reverent and unflinching. What makes it so compelling is the way its narrative moves fluidly between the personal and the political. The man at the center is not just a hero, nor just a victim. He's a mirror, reflecting the hopes and fears of a people through his choices and the consequences that follow. We see him as a youth, driven by idealism, his eyes still wide at the world's possibilities. Then, as the years roll on, we witness the erosion and reinforcement of his beliefs, tested against betrayal, love, ambition, and loss. His journey isn't linear. It curves and doubles back just as history does, filled with contradictions and moments of startling clarity. The scope of this story alone could intimidate a lesser film, but here it feels deliberate, necessary. We pass through eras marked by colonization, war, rebellion, and uneasy peace. Each period comes alive with its own texture, villages framed by rivers and mountains, smoke-filled rooms where politicians whisper about the future, wide avenues where parades and protests collide. The passage of time is marked not only by changes in costume or setting, but by shifts in tone, color, and atmosphere. The past feels warm and textured, the present sharp and restless, the future uncertain and tinged with melancholy. And then there are the people orbiting the central figure, friends, lovers, enemies, family. They enter and exit his life like the tides, some leaving scars, others leaving warmth, and a few leaving mysteries that echo long after the scene fades. These relationships are not mere subplots, they are threads in the larger weave, their outcomes shaping his path as much as any grand political event. In some ways, the interpersonal dynamics feel like the true battlefield, where loyalties are tested and ideals are bartered for survival. The beauty of this film's structure is that it refuses to simplify. It doesn't present its central figure as an untouchable icon, but as a man made of contradictions, capable of bravery and cowardice, wisdom and folly. We don't just admire him, we question him, and in doing so, we question ourselves. What compromises would we make in his place? How would we navigate the shifting sands of power and morality when both seem to blur into one another? It's a story that never lets you stay comfortable. The opening moments set the tone perfectly, a gathering that feels celebratory on the surface but hums with a quiet undercurrent of tension. People exchange pleasantries while their eyes betray something deeper, curiosity, resentment, longing. It's here that we first sense the weight of what's to come, a sense that this man's story is not just his own, but somehow belongs to everyone in the room. From there we're drawn back in time, not through flashy transitions, but through the gentle pull of memory and conversation, each recollection a stepping stone deeper into the past. The first act brims with youthful ambition and raw energy. We see the man before the burdens truly settle on his shoulders, before the compromises chip away at the edges of his ideals. The world seems wider, opportunities limitless, and yet there's already a shadow at the edge of the frame, a whisper that nothing stays untouched for long. Each choice, no matter how small, sends ripples outward, some of which won't crash back into his life until decades later. As the years roll on, the narrative gains a haunting momentum. Wars begin and end, but the conflicts of the heart remain. Lovers drift apart, not always from betrayal, but from the slow erosion of shared dreams. Friendships fracture over political allegiances or personal ambition. Family ties strain under the weight of expectation and unspoken grievances. And through it all, the man at the center becomes both witness and participant, never fully in control, yet never fully powerless either. One of the film's most intriguing choices is its constant interplay between the intimate and the epic. We might witness a tender exchange between two characters, only for the next scene to erupt into a political rally or a battle. Yet somehow both moments carry equal weight. The quiet conversations are as revolutionary as the speeches, and the smallest gestures, a hand held too long, a glance across a crowded room, can hold as much power as any act of defiance. This is a film that understands that history is not just made by generals and politicians, but by ordinary people making choices in extraordinary times. And it's here that the film's greatest strength lies. Its ability to ground the sweep of national history in the smallest, most human moments. The story never loses sight of the personal cost of political upheaval, nor does it shy away from the uncomfortable truth that progress often leaves someone behind. Of course, woven throughout all this is an air of mystery. There are questions raised early on that linger in the back of your mind, unanswered until the time is right. Who can be trusted? What truly motivates the central figure in his later years? Are the legends told about him grounded in fact, or are they the myths we build around people who become symbols? These unanswered questions keep you leaning forward, searching every frame for clues. By the time the narrative arcs toward its later stages, we've lived a lifetime alongside the central figure. We've felt his triumphs and his losses, watched him stumble and rise again, and seen the way the world has both shaped him and been shaped by him. There's a poignancy in realizing that even the most remarkable lives are still human lives, messy, imperfect, and finite. And that's where this story truly takes hold. It's not about idolizing a man or romanticizing a time in history. It's about seeing the humanity in both. It's about understanding that history's grand sweep is nothing without the people who live it, love through it, fight for it, and sometimes fall under its weight. The film invites us to hold both the beauty and the tragedy in equal measure, to acknowledge that the same forces that inspire greatness can also breed sorrow. There are turns in the story that catch you off guard, moments where you realize the narrative has been quietly setting up a revelation for hours. Some of these are deeply personal, confessions made in whispers, truths revealed too late to change the outcome. Others are historical, the kind of revelations that shift your understanding of everything you've seen before. Both hit with equal force, reminding you that in life, as in film, the personal and the political are rarely separate. By the time the credits roll, you're left with the feeling that you've been entrusted with something precious, a life story that's both specific and universal. It's the kind of film that lingers not just because of what happened, but because of what it made you feel and what it left you wondering. And somewhere in those questions lies the real heart of the journey. The story begins not with a roar of drums or the clash of swords, but with the quiet murmuring of a gathering, people of various ages filling a room whose air seems heavy with unspoken history. There's a birthday being celebrated, though you can tell by the measured movements and occasional faraway looks that the guests are here for more than cake and pleasantries. In one corner sits a man who has outlived most of his contemporaries, his hair now silvered by decades, and his eyes holding the kind of gaze that suggests he has seen too much and yet not enough. He doesn't speak much at first, instead he listens. The voices around him ripple through fragments of memory, each carrying their own version of the truth about his life, and then, almost imperceptibly, the years begin to rewind. The first step backward takes us to a time when the man was far from old, when his steps were quick, his eyes restless with ambition, and his hands uncalloused by the battles to come. The world he inhabits is under the shadow of colonization, a time when the language of the land's rulers is not the language of the people, when streets feel policed not just by uniformed men, but by the tension in the air. Here he moves through the world with a quiet watchfulness, taking in every face and every whispered conversation, as if cataloging a mental map of alliances and threats. His family life is modest but sturdy, bound by the quiet dignity of people who endure without much expectation of reward. He is close to his father, though theirs is the kind of relationship built more on unspoken understanding than on outward affection. His father, a man who believes deeply in duty, has always urged him to think beyond himself, to remember that a man is measured not just by his accomplishments, but by the way he carries the burdens of those who cannot carry their own. This advice lodges itself somewhere deep, though at this stage, he isn't sure if it's a call to service or a chain around his freedom. In these early days, he is surrounded by friends, some destined to remain allies, and others fated to become adversaries. The first hints of political unrest creep into their lives, but at this stage, it's still the kind of unrest that manifests in whispered debates over drinks and the occasional heated argument in a public square. He doesn't yet see himself as a man who will stand at the center of history. He's more concerned with his own personal ambitions, his place in the social hierarchy, and quietly, his fascination with a young woman whose presence in a room seems to bend the light toward her. This woman is different from anyone he has known before. She speaks her mind without the self-consciousness expected of her time, and she possesses a sharp intelligence that both challenges and captivates him. Their early encounters are marked by a subtle push and pull. He is drawn to her confidence, while she seems intrigued by his quiet intensity. For now, theirs is a connection that lives in glances, in fleeting moments stolen between the obligations of their respective worlds. But history is impatient, and before long it demands more of him. The political situation grows less abstract, no longer just the talk of intellectuals in cafes, it begins to seep into daily life. A skirmish in a nearby province sends ripples through the capital. A friend disappears for days and returns with stories of protests broken up by violence. And then, without warning, a personal tragedy strikes, one that tears a hole through his family and leaves him with a choice. Remain in the relative safety of the life he has known, or step into the turbulent current of the times. He chooses the latter, though at first it's less out of ideology than out of a deep sense of personal duty. A family debt, emotional, not financial, binds him to a group of men who are organizing against the colonial government. At first his role is small, delivering messages, gathering supplies, listening more than speaking. But he has a knack for reading situations and people, and this skill quickly catches the attention of the movement's leaders. He's invited into rooms where plans are made, where voices rise in argument about the best way to secure freedom. These meetings are not glamorous. They're held in dimly lit backrooms of modest homes, behind closed doors of small shops, in fields under the cover of night. There's a palpable urgency, but also a constant edge of paranoia. Every participant knows they could be betrayed, and every shadow on the street could be the last thing they see. Here, in these rooms, he begins to understand the weight of what he's chosen to involve himself in. His personal life grows more complicated as his political commitments deepen. The young woman he once admired from afar now becomes a confidant, though their relationship is strained by the secrecy his work demands. She senses the danger in what he's doing and alternates between admiration and fear. They share moments of tenderness, but they are always tinged with the knowledge that either of them could be lost at any moment. A turning point comes when a planned demonstration turns violent. He's there not as a leader but as an observer and supporter, when the crowd surges and the air fills with the sound of gunfire. People scatter in chaos, and in the confusion, he finds himself face to face with the grim reality of his cause. A young boy no older than his own nephews, lying wounded in the street. It's this moment, not the speeches or the slogans, that seals his commitment. He carries the boy to safety, but the image stays with him, replaying in his mind long after the sounds of that day have faded. From that moment forward, his role changes. He is no longer content to operate at the edges. He steps into leadership, organizing smaller cells of the movement, planning actions that strike at the heart of the colonial system without needlessly endangering civilians. His reputation grows, not publicly, for that would be dangerous, but within the network of the resistance. People begin to look to him for guidance, and though he resists the idea of being a figurehead, he can't deny that his decisions are shaping the direction of the struggle. The risks grow, and so do the sacrifices. He spends long stretches away from his family, operating under assumed names, moving from safe house to safe house. He learns to read the subtle signs of danger, a conversation that stops when he enters a room, a neighbor who suddenly becomes too curious about his comings and goings. Trust becomes a rare currency, and betrayal an ever-present possibility. And yet, amidst the danger, there are moments of unexpected beauty. Nights spent on the open road under a canopy of stars, sharing stories with fellow fighters. Quiet dawns when the city is still asleep, and he can walk its streets without fear of recognition. These moments remind him of what they're fighting for, not just political freedom, but the right to live without the constant shadow of fear. As this chapter of his life deepens, the young woman who once occupied his heart becomes a more complex figure in his story. Their paths cross less often now, but when they do, the intensity between them has only grown. She challenges him in ways no one else does, questioning his choices, forcing him to confront the human cost of his decisions. In her eyes, he sees both the man he has become and the man he still aspires to be. But as the movement gains momentum, the stakes rise higher. The colonial authorities, sensing the growing threat, tighten their grip. Raids become more frequent. Friends disappear in the night, some never to be seen again. A planned operation, intended to send a symbolic message to the occupying forces, goes awry, leading to arrests and the death of someone close to him. The loss hits hard, not only for the personal grief, but for the growing awareness that he is now responsible for the lives and fates of others. In the aftermath, he retreats briefly into himself, questioning the path he's on. The cause remains just, but the cost is mounting. It's here, in this moment of doubt, that he begins to see the full scope of what lies ahead, not as a distant possibility, but as a living reality he will have to navigate for the rest of his life. The path forward will demand more than courage. It will demand endurance, sacrifice, and the willingness to carry the weight of choices that cannot be undone. And as this part of the story draws to its close, the man we see is no longer the ambitious youth from the beginning. He has been tempered by fire, shaped by both victory and loss. He stands now at the threshold of the next chapter, aware that the battles to come will test him in ways he has not yet imagined, but unwilling to turn back. The air feels heavier now, as though every breath he takes carries the weight of unspoken fears. There's no longer the wide-eyed wonder of a young man testing his strength against the edges of history. There is only the constant thrum of vigilance, the knowledge that the walls are closing in. His movements are sharper, his silence is longer, and his trust, already a scarce commodity, has shrunk to a handful of people whose loyalty has been tempered by fire. The resistance is no longer a loose network of small, cautious acts. It has become an organized, deliberate machine, with him at its center more often than he would like to admit. His name, though still spoken in whispers, carries weight. Messages arrive from distant provinces asking for guidance. New recruits, too young to remember the world before the occupation, look to him for purpose, treating his words like scripture. He is both proud and uneasy about this. Leadership, he's learned, is as much about protecting others from the truth as it is about telling it. The young woman who once existed at the periphery of his political life now becomes a pivotal force within it. She has joined the struggle in her own way, working from the inside in places where he cannot easily reach. Their encounters are rare, often snatched in fleeting hours between missions, but they are charged with an intensity that feels almost dangerous in itself. She knows the risks perhaps better than he does, and yet she refuses to step back. When they talk, it is not of romance but of strategy, of survival, of what the world might look like if they win. In her presence, he feels the pull of a life that could have been quiet, personal, free of the constant threat, but he knows that to indulge in such thoughts too long would be fatal. The enemy, sensing the resistance's growing strength, begins to adapt. Where once they relied on blunt force, raids, arrests, public executions, they now employ subtler weapons, infiltration, disinformation, the sowing of doubt. Rumors spread through the network, whispered questions about who might be working for the other side. Paranoia takes root, and even the most steadfast fighters begin to look sideways at one another. One night, a trusted comrade fails to appear at a rendezvous point. Hours later, word comes that he's been captured. The official report claims he was caught alone, but those who know the truth suspect a setup. The implications are chilling. Someone in their midst is feeding information to the enemy. It is during this period of suspicion that the most audacious plan yet comes to the table, a coordinated strike that could cripple a key arm of the colonial administration. The risks are monumental. Failure could decimate the movement. He hesitates, weighing the odds, but the momentum of the resistance is a force of its own now. The plan moves forward. The operation begins under the cover of night, with small teams fanning out to their assigned positions. Everything seems to be unfolding as intended, until it doesn't. A sudden flare of searchlights, the sound of boots pounding on cobblestones, and shouts in a language not their own. The enemy was ready. What follows is chaos, orders shouted and ignored, fighters scattering into the maze of alleys, the sharp crack of gunfire echoing off stone walls. He finds himself cornered, separated from his unit. In that moment, instinct takes over. He slips through a narrow passage, dives into a drainage tunnel, and disappears into the darkness. When he emerges hours later, drenched and shivering, the city is eerily quiet. He makes his way to a safe house, only to learn that many did not make it out. Among the missing is the woman whose presence has been both his anchor and his reminder of what's at stake. Days stretch into weeks without word of her fate. Each rumor cuts deeper. Some say she's been imprisoned, others that she's gone into hiding. A few whisper that she may have switched sides to survive. He refuses to believe the last of these, but the seed of doubt gnaws at him, not because he doubts her loyalty, but because he knows too well the cruel choices war forces upon people. In her absence, he throws himself into the work with a kind of grim determination. The resistance is battered but not broken. They regroup, smaller now but more disciplined, their operations more calculated. His leadership becomes colder, more pragmatic. Where once he weighed every action against the potential cost in lives, he now makes decisions with the detached precision of someone who has learned that sentiment can be a liability. And then without warning, she returns. The moment is almost surreal. He's in the middle of a meeting when the door opens, and there she stands, thinner, her eyes sharper, but very much alive. She says little of where she's been, only that she has information they can use. He doesn't press for details. He knows better than to demand a full account in front of others. Later, in private, she tells him fragments of her time away, enough to confirm his fears about the dangers she faced, but also enough to convince him of her resilience. Her return injects a new energy into their efforts. With her intelligence, they manage to anticipate enemy moves, to strike in ways that feel almost surgical. The tide begins slowly to turn. Yet with each success comes greater scrutiny, and the enemy responds with a campaign of terror aimed not at the fighters themselves, but at the communities that shelter them. Entire neighborhoods are punished for harboring suspected sympathizers. Homes are burned, families displaced. It is here that the moral calculus becomes unbearable. For the first time, he considers walking away, not out of fear for himself, but out of guilt for the suffering his cause has brought to those who did not choose it. When he voices these doubts to her, she listens without judgment, then asks the question he has been avoiding. If you stop, will it all have been for nothing? He has no answer. The climax comes in the form of one last, desperate gambit. Intelligence reaches them of a meeting between high-ranking colonial officials, a meeting that, if disrupted, could shift the balance decisively. The plan is dangerous, relying on precise timing and the cooperation of multiple cells spread across the city. Everyone involved knows the risks. Some make quiet preparations for the possibility they will not return. The night of the operation is tense, every sound amplified by the pounding of blood in his ears. The teams move into position, each waiting for the signal. And then, as if in some cruel echo of the earlier betrayal, the enemy arrives early. The fight that follows is brutal, close quarters, no longer the shadow war they have grown accustomed to, but a direct confrontation. In the chaos, he sees her across the room, engaged in a struggle with a uniformed officer. Their eyes meet for a split second before she disappears into the melee. He pushes toward her, cutting through the fray, but by the time he reaches the spot, she is gone. The rest is a blur. Explosions, shouts, the acrid sting of smoke. When he finally emerges into the cool night air, he is carrying not victory but the heavy knowledge that the cost has been higher than anyone imagined. The operation is only partially successful, enough to send a message, but not enough to end the fight. In the days that follow, the movement scatters once again. Some are captured, others go into deep hiding. He remains in the city, moving from one safe house to another, haunted by the question of what became of her. Weeks later, a message reaches him unsigned, but in her handwriting. It says only, "Keep going." Those words settle into him like a final gift, not of closure but of resolve. He understands now that this fight is not about winning in his lifetime, but about carrying the flame forward so that others may one day see its light. He will not see the end of it, but that no longer matters. What matters is that the struggle continues, that the sacrifices are not forgotten, that the story, his story, remains a thread in the vast tapestry of a people's fight for freedom. When we leave him, he is once again at a gathering, older now, the lines on his face deeper, the weight of memory heavier. Around him, voices speak of the past as though it were a distant country, but he knows better. The past lives in the present, shaping it, haunting it, and perhaps, one day, redeeming it. He sits quietly, listening, holding within him the echoes of battles fought in shadows, and the faces of those who walked beside him into the fire. He was never meant to be just a soldier. That's the first thing that becomes clear when you look at him, not just the way he moves or speaks, but the way he carries his own history like a second skin. There's a restlessness there, but also a certain gravity, a pull toward responsibility that he can't quite escape. From the moment we meet him, he is less a man of circumstance and more a man shaped by the unrelenting tide of events. His life begins with the uncertainty of a nation caught between hope and oppression. The formative years are full of contradictions, moments of laughter punctuated by the sharp reality of violence just outside the door. That kind of childhood leaves its mark. For him, it breeds a distrust of stability, an understanding that peace is a fragile illusion. So even before he is fully grown, he has the instincts of someone always ready to flee or fight, depending on what the moment demands. What's fascinating about him is how this cautious instinct transforms over time into something far more active. When war and occupation rise like a storm on the horizon, he doesn't simply retreat into survival. He chooses the harder path, the one that asks not only for courage but for sacrifice. And yet, even in those early days of resistance, there's an undercurrent of doubt, not about the cause, but about himself. It's as though he's perpetually testing the limits of his own resolve, unsure of where the breaking point might be. That inner tension is what makes him compelling. He is no unshakable hero in the traditional sense. He is instead a man constantly negotiating with his own fear and longing. When he stands in the dim glow of a safe house lamp, maps spread before him, planning the next move, there's a quiet in his face that tells you he is also imagining the cost, the names of those who might not make it back. That awareness, far from weakening him, sharpens his decisions. He fights not because he believes himself invincible, but because he knows exactly what's at stake. The woman who comes into his life, equally intelligent, equally fierce, becomes more than a partner in the struggle. She is in many ways his mirror. Where he is prone to moments of doubt, she moves with a clarity of purpose that both steadies and challenges him. Their relationship is one of layered silences and unspoken understandings. They rarely speak of love in conventional terms. Instead, their intimacy is built in fragments, a hand lingering on a shoulder before parting ways for a mission, a shared look across a crowded, dangerous room. She becomes the measure of his vulnerability, the reminder that the fight is not only for the nameless future, but also for something deeply personal. Then there is the comrade who has been with him since the earliest days, the one whose loyalty is so ingrained that it almost feels like blood. This friend brings with him a different kind of courage, the kind that thrives in laughter even when surrounded by shadows. In the darkest moments, it is this character who can turn tension into something bearable, who can remind everyone why they are still fighting. And yet his story is no lighter. His optimism is hard-won, tempered by loss. When tragedy eventually touches him directly, the shift in his demeanor is subtle but devastating. Less banter, more silence, and a gaze that lingers too long on the horizon. Among the resistance, there's also the young recruit, a reminder of the idealism that once lived in the protagonist himself. The boy's eagerness, his lack of hesitation, is both inspiring and unsettling. The older fighters see themselves in him, but they also see the danger of inexperience. The protagonist takes a cautious interest in him, torn between wanting to shield him from the harshest realities and knowing that such protection is impossible in a war like this. Over time, the recruit learns the same lesson everyone here must. Survival is not about avoiding danger, but about enduring it without losing yourself completely. The antagonist in this story is not just one man, though there is a singular enemy figure who emerges as a personal threat. He is the embodiment of the occupying power, calculated, watchful, and skilled at reading people. What makes him dangerous is not just his authority or resources, but his understanding of human weakness. He knows how to turn suspicion into a weapon, how to break trust from the inside out. And he takes a particular interest in the protagonist, sensing in him both a worthy opponent and a man with cracks in his armor. Their interactions, rare but charged, feel like a chess match played with lives instead of pieces. What's interesting is that the protagonist doesn't define himself solely in opposition to this enemy. His moral compass is not reactive but self-forged. The cause he serves shapes his actions, yes, but it is his own internal code, built from years of observation, mistakes, and small victories, that truly guides him. He will bend rules when needed, but he won't cross certain lines, even when it might be expedient. That restraint costs him at times, and yet it's also what sets him apart from those who descend into the same brutality they are fighting against. Through all this, we watch how war erodes and reforges identity. The protagonist we see in the later chapters is harder, less trusting, and far more decisive. The young man who once hesitated before making a choice now acts with calculated swiftness, understanding that hesitation can mean death. And yet, deep beneath the hardened exterior, the same core remains, the one that values connection, that remembers faces, that still pauses when confronted with needless suffering. The woman's arc is equally layered. She begins as someone who operates largely in her own sphere, but over time, her path becomes inseparable from his. Her resilience is different, quieter, but no less unyielding. When she disappears for a time, her absence reverberates through the narrative, not just as a personal loss for him, but as a strategic blow to the movement. And when she returns, altered by what she's endured, the reunion is not a moment of pure joy but a complex recalibration. They have both changed, and the bond they share now carries the weight of those changes. Even the secondary characters, the informants, the sympathetic civilians, the cautious allies, are given enough depth to feel real. Each has their own reasons for involvement, their own breaking points. One former ally, for example, chooses self-preservation over loyalty, betraying information that leads to devastating losses. And while the act is unforgivable in the eyes of the resistance, the narrative gives us enough of his perspective to understand that his choice was born not from malice, but from desperation. Ultimately, the story is a tapestry of intersecting arcs, each thread shaped by the moral and emotional pressures of war. The protagonist's journey is at the center, but it's the interplay between all these lives, the ways they support, strain, betray, and save one another, that gives the narrative its richness. In a world where every decision carries the potential for irreversible consequences, character is not a fixed trait, but an evolving response to impossible circumstances. By the end, we understand that none of them are untouched. Even the survivors are altered, their victories complicated by the losses that made them possible. The protagonist, in particular, stands as a figure not of triumph in the conventional sense, but of endurance. He remains, still carrying the same quiet weight, still moving forward not because he believes in an inevitable victory, but because stopping would mean erasing everything they have fought for. It is that persistence, more than any single act of heroism, that defines him, and perhaps in the end that is the truest measure of his character. There's something almost mythic about the way certain films come into being, and this one carries that kind of aura, like a project that was never meant to be easy, never meant to arrive in the world without collecting its share of strange stories along the way. When people talk about the behind-the-scenes history, their voices shift, half amusement, half reverence, as though they're remembering not just the making of a movie, but surviving a kind of epic journey in itself. The first unusual fact is sheer scale. This wasn't just a film that you could shoot over a handful of weeks in a couple of sound stages. It was sprawling. The production stretched across multiple provinces, with the crew often moving like a traveling caravan, lugging cameras, lighting rigs, period-accurate props, and entire wardrobes through muddy roads, unpredictable weather, and terrain that seemed determined to test their resolve. In some locations, the set had to be built from the ground up, not a temporary frame with plywood facades, but fully functional environments that could withstand the demands of the script. That commitment meant that for weeks before filming even began, there was an entire secondary production, construction teams, set decorators, and historical consultants working in tandem to create an immersive world. One of the strangest and most whispered-about stories comes from the days when they were filming in a particularly remote village. There, the locals, who had been generously accommodating, warned the crew about certain areas that didn't like to be disturbed. At first, the production team brushed it off as local superstition, but then came the night when their generator inexplicably died just as they were about to shoot a critical scene. No amount of tinkering from the electricians could bring it back to life. They packed up, resigned to losing the day. The next morning, the village elder asked if they had done the proper introductions to the land spirits. Whether out of respect or quiet desperation, the crew followed the ritual he suggested. That evening, the generator purred back to life as though nothing had happened. No one could explain it technically, but from that point onward, the team made it a point to acknowledge the local customs before setting up in a new area. Then there was the matter of the wardrobe. The costumes were meticulously researched, drawing on period photographs, museum archives, and the expertise of historians who specialized in the era. But the clothing wasn't just there for looks. It had to endure real physical wear and tear. The action sequences, especially those involving skirmishes, escapes, and long marches, meant that garments were constantly being ripped, mudded, or outright destroyed. The costume department became a kind of emergency triage unit, working late into the night to patch and restore key pieces so they would be camera-ready the next day. One memorable incident involved a coat that was a signature item for the lead character. During an intense chase sequence, the coat snagged on a protruding nail and tore almost in half. Production halted, and rather than replace it with a duplicate, the director insisted it be repaired exactly, believing the wear and damage were part of the character's visual story. Even the props had their own set of adventures. The firearms, for example, were period-accurate replicas, but because the film required so many close-ups and action shots, they had to be modified to function safely without losing authenticity. In one early take, a prop rifle backfired, not dangerously, but enough to cause a startled reaction that the director loved so much he kept it in the final cut. There's a quiet joy in moments like that, where an accident becomes a piece of the character's truth. Some of the most charming behind-the-scenes details involve the cast's camaraderie. Despite the often grim tone of the story, between takes they formed something of a family. They shared meals cooked on makeshift stoves, played cards under tarps during rain delays, and developed a running joke about the ghost extra, a background actor who seemed to unintentionally appear in far more scenes than planned. By the time post-production rolled around, editors swore they could spot him in the crowd during moments where he hadn't even been scheduled to work. And speaking of post-production, the editing process brought its own unexpected discoveries. Because the film was shot in so many different environments and under such varied lighting conditions, the color grading team faced the enormous challenge of making every sequence feel like part of the same continuous world. In doing so, they uncovered tiny continuity details that had gone unnoticed during filming, like a single prop book that somehow migrated from a rural farmhouse scene to an urban street sequence months later. The continuity supervisor joked that the book had its own subplot no one was aware of. The sound design team also found themselves with an unusual problem. Many scenes had been shot in locations where ambient noise was nearly impossible to control. Roosters crowing in the background, distant church bells, motorbikes rumbling over dirt roads miles away. Instead of erasing all of these, the director decided to integrate some into the final soundscape, arguing that they added a layer of authenticity you couldn't fake. In one climactic scene, the faint echo of a bell in the distance is not a planned score cue, but an actual church calling to service in the village where they were filming. One of the more surreal moments came from a massive crowd sequence. Extras were brought in from surrounding areas, many of whom had never seen a film set before. The director, known for his perfectionism, spent hours choreographing the movement of hundreds of people so that it would feel both chaotic and believable. Midway through the shoot, a sudden downpour threatened to ruin the entire day's work. Instead of retreating, the director told everyone to keep going. The resulting footage, wet clothes, muddy ground, faces streaked with rain, was so striking that it became one of the film's most visually memorable moments. Another bit of trivia that still circulates among film enthusiasts: the lead actor performed several of his own stunts, even when the crew strongly advised against it. There's one sequence where he leaps from a moving vehicle onto a patch of uneven ground, and the landing was far rougher than anticipated. He limped for days afterward, but insisted that the authenticity was worth it. The shot remains in the film exactly as it happened, and you can spot the genuine wince if you know where to look. Even the script had its quirks. Originally, the story was structured in a strictly linear timeline. But during editing, the director began experimenting with non-linear sequences, cutting back and forth between different years of the protagonist's life to create a richer emotional tapestry. This decision meant that certain scenes were repurposed entirely. Dialogue meant for one moment was layered into another, creating new meanings that weren't present on the page. In interviews, the screenwriter admitted that this reworking improved the story beyond what he'd imagined, though he was initially skeptical when the director suggested it. There's also the legend of the lost reel. Midway through shooting, one of the reels of raw footage went missing for several days. Panic rippled through the crew. Reshoots would be impossible without blowing the budget. Just as quietly as it disappeared, the reel reappeared in the storage truck, sitting neatly atop a stack of cases. To this day, no one has confessed to moving it, and theories range from an innocent mix-up to a prank pulled by a crew member with a mischievous streak. When you step back and piece together all these oddities, the generator that refused to start until the crew followed a local ritual, the coat that became a character in itself, the migrating prop book, the accidental sound cues, it paints a picture of a production that was as alive and unpredictable as the story it set out to tell. In the end, that's perhaps the strangest and most beautiful fact of all. The movie you see on screen is not just the product of a script and a camera, but of countless small, strange moments where reality slipped into the frame and refused to let go. When you look closely at the major events that shaped this film, they don't simply function as narrative checkpoints. They act like tectonic plates beneath the surface, shifting the emotional and thematic landscape with every movement. Each sequence seems to carry an echo, a reverberation that affects not only the characters, but also the viewer's understanding of the story's moral and philosophical framework. It's not the kind of storytelling where the plot is just a chain of cause and effect. Here, every decision and every confrontation feels freighted with meaning, and each key moment reshapes the emotional contract between the film and its audience. One of the earliest pivotal events sets the tone for everything that follows. It's a sequence that's not merely about plot, it's about the way the film forces the viewer to sit in discomfort. A confrontation unfolds not with sweeping orchestral cues or grand speeches, but in the taut, controlled rhythm of silence and hesitation. The way the camera lingers on faces, catching the micro-expressions that betray fear, regret, or calculation, creates a dynamic where the absence of overt action becomes as telling as any gunfight or chase scene. From a critical perspective, this restraint functions almost like a thesis statement. This is a story that will measure heroism, not in how loudly someone acts, but in how quietly they endure or resist. This approach to pacing and tension reaches another high point during a mid-film turning event, one that is, in traditional genre terms, the big reversal. What's fascinating about the way it's staged is that it upends viewer expectations without leaning on shock for shock's sake. Instead, it reveals information in a staggered way, letting the audience process the implications alongside the characters. This choice aligns with the principles of cinematic realism, often discussed in film theory. By making the audience actively piece together meaning instead of delivering it in a neat package, the narrative fosters a deeper investment. The result is that this moment lands with both intellectual weight and emotional punch. It's not just about what happened, but about the moral territory it opens up. A key action sequence later in the story works almost like a pressure valve for the tension built up over earlier acts. On the surface, it's a spectacle, meticulously choreographed, shot with dynamic camera movement, and scored in a way that amplifies every heartbeat. But from a critical standpoint, it's also a layered exploration of chaos versus control. The protagonist's movements through the environment aren't just tactical choices, they're manifestations of their evolving worldview. Each split-second decision, whether to engage, evade, or protect someone else, becomes a visual metaphor for the internal battle between personal survival and collective responsibility. It's in moments like these that the film's thematic strands tie themselves to the action so tightly that the line between the two disappears. The film's narrative structure is also worth noting in how it handles parallel events. At several points, scenes in different locations mirror each other, not literally in terms of the action taking place, but in emotional tone and thematic resonance. For example, a quiet conversation between two secondary characters might be intercut with a tense, dangerous situation elsewhere. On paper, these seem unrelated, but the juxtaposition reframes both, inviting the viewer to see them as part of a shared thematic pattern, perhaps about loyalty, trust, or the costs of betrayal. This kind of structural echo isn't accidental. It's an editing choice that subtly invites literary modes of reading, where parallels across chapters deepen the text's meaning. There's also a remarkable moment near the final act where the film stages a moral crossroads with minimal dialogue. The choice facing the central character is presented not as a question of good versus evil, but as a negotiation between competing values: duty, love, vengeance, self-preservation. What makes this so potent is that the scene trusts the audience to feel the full weight of these choices without spelling out every implication. The mise-en scene does the heavy lifting. The placement of figures in the frame, the play of light and shadow, even the positioning of props all become part of the storytelling grammar. A critic might read this as an invocation of classical tragedy, where fate is inextricably bound to a character's own virtues and flaws. Thematically, the most significant events in the film return again and again to the question of legacy, what is passed down, whether intentionally or as an unintended consequence of one's actions. The script plants seeds for this from early on. Small exchanges that seem incidental gain weight as the story progresses, revealing themselves as early threads in a much larger tapestry. By the time these threads are pulled tight in later events, the viewer realizes that what seemed like personal choices have rippled outward into the lives of many others. From a reception standpoint, this creates a kind of moral aftershock for the audience. The story lingers not just because of what happened, but because of what it says about the interconnectedness of lives. One of the film's more controversial events, polarizing in its reception, is a sequence where the protagonist's agency is sharply curtailed by external forces. Some critics have argued that this moment undermines the character's arc, while others see it as essential to the film's commentary on power and control. Personally, I find it to be one of the boldest moves in the narrative. By stripping away the illusion that individual willpower alone can overcome systemic obstacles, the film forces the audience to confront uncomfortable truths about limitations, something rarely tackled so directly in mainstream storytelling. The discomfort this creates is precisely what makes the sequence so thematically rich. It leaves the viewer wrestling with ambiguity instead of offering clean resolutions. From a cinematic language perspective, these critical events are tied together by the film's commitment to visual storytelling. Rarely does it rely on exposition to contextualize a plot point. Instead, it layers meaning through framing, pacing, and sound design. In one striking example, a crucial reveal is made entirely through a change in the background environment, a subtle shift that only fully registers moments later, creating a delayed emotional impact. This is a hallmark of a director who trusts the audience's attentiveness, and it's a decision that elevates the film from conventional narrative into something closer to a literary experience on screen. The reception to these events among audiences and critics alike has been shaped by their emotional resonance. Viewers who approach the film expecting straightforward action or melodrama often find themselves surprised, and sometimes unsettled, by the reflective, morally complex territory it navigates. Those with a literary or theoretical background tend to appreciate how these moments operate on multiple levels, as plot, as theme, and as meta-commentary on storytelling itself. This layered quality is what gives the film staying power. People don't just remember what happened, they remember how it made them think and feel. And then there's the final major event, the one that lingers in the mind long after the credits roll. It's not the loudest or most visually extravagant scene, but it's the one that crystallizes the story's emotional core. By this point, the viewer has been trained to watch for small details, to read the language of the film in ways that go beyond the literal. The resolution here works because it draws on every emotional beat that came before, every moment of tension, every hard choice, and distills them into a single, quiet truth. It's a moment that doesn't announce itself as the climax, yet it's impossible to imagine the story without it. That, in itself, is the mark of an event that transcends its immediate function and becomes part of the film's thematic DNA. In the end, the significance of these events isn't confined to their role in the plot. They shape the viewer's engagement, reframing the narrative not as a sequence of what happens next, but as a meditation on why these things matter and how they reverberate through the characters' lives. Each one is a lens through which the story's broader ideas about power, morality, legacy, and human connection come into sharper focus. And it's in that cumulative layering of meaning, rather than in any single twist or reveal, that the film earns its emotional and intellectual resonance. The making of this film feels, in retrospect, like a story within the story, a parallel narrative unfolding in dusty backlots, makeshift production offices, and under the punishing glare of location sunrises. You can sense it when you watch the finished work. There's a lived-in quality, a texture to the performances and the framing, that doesn't come from technical perfection alone, but from the kind of camaraderie and stubborn persistence that only happens when a cast and crew are bound by the strange magic of bringing something this ambitious to life. It began with a script that had been in gestation far longer than most of the people involved care to admit. Draft after draft was passed between hands, each iteration tweaking the political undertones here, adding a quiet moment of reflection there. The director, who had a reputation for meticulously mapping out storyboards, approached the material not just as a piece of entertainment, but as a historical and emotional statement. When pre-production kicked off, the energy in the room was a mix of nervous excitement and dawning realization. This wasn't going to be an easy shoot. One of the earliest and most critical decisions was location scouting. While some interiors could be constructed on sound stages, much of the story's power depended on the authenticity of its settings. The production team crisscrossed regions for weeks, looking for places that still carried the architecture and atmosphere of the eras the film would span. They weren't just looking for backdrops, they were hunting for spaces that felt like they had their own histories, their own ghosts. Eventually, they settled on a blend of real heritage sites and painstakingly aged sets built to match period detail down to the smallest chipped paint. Sourcing props became its own adventure. The art department dove into antique markets, private collections, and even government archives to secure historically accurate uniforms, documents, and personal effects. In one memorable incident, a production assistant spent nearly an entire week negotiating with a small-town collector for the loan of a specific model of radio that appears for only a few seconds in the final cut. The collector finally agreed, but only if he could be on set during filming to ensure the prop was handled with respect. He ended up staying for 2 full days, regaling crew members with stories about his youth during the era depicted in the film, which in turn inspired subtle changes to background details in those scenes. The shoot itself was a study in contrasts. Some days were tightly controlled, with call sheets followed to the minute, camera setups moving with the efficiency of a military operation. Other days descended into beautiful chaos, as weather, light, or unexpected crowd interruptions forced the team to improvise. On one particularly hot afternoon, a sudden downpour threatened to ruin an entire outdoor sequence. Instead of packing up, the director decided to embrace it, rewriting the blocking on the spot to incorporate the rain into the scene. That unplanned choice ended up producing some of the film's most visually arresting images, with rivulets of water cascading off uniforms and streets glistening like sheets of glass under dim street lamps. The cast, too, threw themselves into the process in ways that went beyond their contractual obligations. The lead actor was known for his physical preparation, and for this role he spent weeks with a military consultant to perfect the posture, gait, and small gestures of someone with years of disciplined service. He insisted on performing many of his own stunts, much to the chagrin of the stunt coordinator, who frequently had to negotiate compromises between safety and authenticity. Meanwhile, one of the supporting actresses took it upon herself to shadow women in local markets and community spaces, observing how they carried themselves, spoke, and interacted in ways that would inform her quieter, more intimate scenes. Between takes, there was a surprising amount of levity for a production tackling such weighty subject matter. Crew members recalled that the director, despite his reputation for being exacting, had a sly sense of humor that emerged during long nights of shooting. There was an ongoing game where he'd hide small, anachronistic objects, like a modern soda can or a rubber duck, somewhere in the set, challenging the camera team to spot and remove them before rolling. This playful ritual became a morale booster during the most grueling stretches of production. The technical side of the filmmaking was equally demanding. Cinematographers opted for a mix of traditional film stock and modern digital capture, carefully matching their color grading in post to create a cohesive look. The decision to use real, practical lighting whenever possible added a tactile quality to the visuals, but also meant that the crew spent hours rigging period-accurate lamps, candles, and lanterns to achieve the desired mood. Sound was another battlefield. Since many of the locations were near bustling urban centers, the audio team often had to fight against the intrusion of modern noise. There's a running joke among the sound crew about how many takes were ruined by the distant honk of a motorcycle or the unexpected bark of a stray dog. Editing began while shooting was still underway, with the director and editor working closely to shape the rhythm of the story as it unfolded. They didn't just trim for time. They experimented with juxtaposing certain sequences in ways that heightened thematic connections. A scene of quiet domestic life, for example, might be followed immediately by the chaos of a public demonstration, emphasizing the fragile balance between personal and political spheres. The score, composed in parallel, was recorded using a mix of orchestral arrangements and traditional instruments from the cultural setting of the film, weaving another layer of authenticity into the work. Not everything went according to plan. There was a near disaster when a key piece of set design was accidentally damaged by a passing vehicle the day before filming a pivotal scene. With no time for full repairs, the art team improvised a cosmetic fix that not only worked on camera, but actually made the set look more realistically worn. Another challenge came during a night shoot when a generator failed midway through, plunging the set into darkness. Rather than calling it a night, the crew scrambled to reconfigure the blocking around a single working light source, and the resulting footage turned out to be one of the most atmospheric in the entire film. For all the logistical hurdles, there were moments when everything clicked, the kind of moments that remind everyone why they endure the heat, the fatigue, and the endless takes. One such day came during the filming of a climactic monologue. The actor, fully immersed in the moment, delivered the speech with such raw conviction that the set fell into absolute silence. When the take ended, no one moved for several seconds, as if breaking the stillness would diminish what they had just witnessed. Even the usually stoic camera operator admitted to feeling a lump in his throat. The production wrapped later than scheduled, but without losing its sense of purpose. In interviews afterward, crew members described the experience as one of the most demanding, but also most rewarding projects they had ever worked on. Many spoke of the friendships forged in the pressure cooker of the shoot, relationships that extended well beyond the final day of filming. Some of the behind-the-scenes photographs taken during this time have since surfaced in retrospectives, showing a side of the process that the finished film can only hint at. The exhaustion, the bursts of laughter, the shared pride in pulling off something that felt nearly impossible at times. Even in post-release discussions, certain behind-the-scenes moments have taken on a life of their own among fans. That rainy day scene, for example, is now often cited as an example of how flexibility and openness to chance can yield some of a film's most memorable imagery. The meticulous prop sourcing efforts have inspired detailed online analyses of background objects, with viewers spotting items and tracing their historical accuracy, and the anachronism game, while of course edited out of the final product, remains a beloved inside joke among those who were there. Looking back, it's clear that the alchemy of this film wasn't just in its script or its performances. It was in the way the production adapted, improvised, and infused every obstacle with creativity. The finished work is richer for it, layered not only with narrative meaning, but with the lived experiences of those who built it, moment by moment, in conditions that demanded both discipline and playfulness. And that's perhaps the most enduring fun fact of all. Behind every frame lies a network of invisible choices, accidents, and acts of care that make the film feel as alive as the story it tells. The world built within the film is not just a passive backdrop. It breathes, shifts, and speaks, shaping the story in ways that are sometimes loud and obvious, other times so subtle you almost don't notice until you feel the weight of it pressing in on you. Every frame carries the mark of deliberate choices about where and how the narrative unfolds, and those choices do as much to define the film's tone as any line of dialogue or note of music. The opening sequence sets the tone immediately, plunging us into a location that feels as if it has lived for centuries before the first character ever sets foot in it. The geography is not neatly arranged or prettily lit. Instead, it is jagged and imperfect, a tapestry of urban decay, rural wilderness, and ceremonial spaces, all chosen with meticulous precision. When you see a street in this film, you don't just see cobblestones or dust. You see history embedded in each crack, stories etched into the faded signage, echoes of feet that have walked there before. The art department didn't just dress the set, they allowed time to sit heavily on it, as if the place itself has a memory. In the rural scenes, wide stretches of open land roll into the horizon, but instead of romanticizing them, the cinematography captures their raw, unforgiving beauty. The grass bends to the wind in uneven patches, the earth is dark and heavy with use, and the trees bear the marks of storms that have come and gone. These outdoor spaces serve as a visual metaphor for endurance, places that have withstood hardship and still stand, mirroring the resilience of the story's central figures. The weather becomes part of the visual language too, shifting from blinding heat to sudden storms, mirroring emotional transitions and narrative turning points. In contrast, the urban locations thrum with a different energy. Narrow alleyways twist and turn like veins, the light slicing through in angular shards. Marketplaces teem with life, but there's a controlled chaos in the way they are shot. Close-ups of hands exchanging goods, flashes of eyes in the crowd, the constant movement of fabric, produce, and people. The camera rarely gives you a full, static view of these spaces. Instead, it moves with the same unpredictable rhythm as the environment itself, forcing you to feel the press and pace of the city. The set designers leaned into imperfection, walls with peeling paint, uneven stone steps, cluttered stalls, because these flaws create authenticity, grounding the characters in a tangible, lived-in reality. Then there are the interiors, which become intimate stages for the film's most personal moments. Rooms are not just rooms, they are microcosms of the character who inhabits them. One protagonist's home is sparse, almost military in its precision, with furniture positioned for functionality rather than comfort. Another's space is layered with personal relics. Photographs curling at the edges, mismatched mugs, a stack of worn books on the table. The production design team treated these details as part of the storytelling, ensuring that you could learn as much about a character from the objects in their space as from anything they said aloud. Cinematography weaves all of these locations into a unified emotional landscape. The visual approach alternates between long, sweeping takes that allow the audience to soak in the environment and tight, claustrophobic framing that draws the focus inward. Wide shots are often used to show isolation, placing a lone figure against a vast and indifferent backdrop. Conversely, close-ups are deployed not just to capture expressions, but to heighten tension, especially in moments where the setting itself plays an active role in the drama, like the shadow of a doorway creeping towards someone, or the flicker of a candle in a room too dark for comfort. Lighting is another major character in this film. Natural light dominates the exteriors, lending them a stark honesty, while interiors often rely on practical sources, lamps, lanterns, even open flames, that pool light unevenly, creating pockets of warmth amid shadow. This interplay of light and darkness serves both aesthetic and symbolic purposes. It draws the viewer's eye to what matters in the frame, while suggesting the moral and emotional ambiguities at play. Night sequences are particularly striking, using deep blacks and soft glows to create a painterly quality, as if each frame could hang on a wall. Color grading subtly shifts across the film's timeline. Early scenes are warmer, with earthy tones and golden light that suggest a tenuous sense of stability. As the story progresses and conflicts deepen, the palette cools and desaturates, pulling the viewer into a more somber and uncertain emotional space. By the final act, color and light have been stripped back to their bare essentials, matching the stark reality the characters face. It's a quiet transformation that you might only consciously register on a second viewing, but it works powerfully in the background to guide your emotional response. Sound design interacts with these settings in ways that make them feel even more immersive. In rural scenes, the silence is rarely total. You hear the faint rustle of leaves, the distant call of birds, the uneven crunch of gravel underfoot. In the city, every alley and marketplace has its own texture of noise, layered so intricately that you could close your eyes and still map the space in your mind. The filmmakers avoided overscoring scenes, often letting ambient sound carry the emotional weight, trusting the setting's own voice to speak for itself. Even the movement of the camera is influenced by the setting. In open landscapes, it glides slowly, sometimes tracking alongside characters at a measured pace, as if respecting the scale of the environment. In crowded or tense interiors, it moves more urgently, with quick pans and handheld shots that mimic the instability of the moment. There's an intentional rhythm to these shifts, calm stretches of visual breathing space punctuated by bursts of kinetic energy, mirroring the ebb and flow of the narrative. Certain locations take on near-mythic significance because they recur at key points in the story. A riverbank, first shown as a place of quiet reflection, becomes the site of a pivotal confrontation later. A cramped meeting room, lit by a single hanging bulb, is where strategies are whispered in one act and where truths are revealed in another. These repeated settings build a visual continuity, making the world feel cohesive and lived in, while allowing for layered emotional associations to develop over time. One of the film's most visually powerful sequences takes place in a public square, framed by imposing colonial-era architecture. The scene is staged to highlight the contrast between the scale of the buildings and the vulnerability of the individuals moving through them. The camera pulls back slowly during the climax, letting the audience see how small the characters appear against the weight of history and power, underscoring themes of resistance and resilience. It's not just the major locations that matter. The transitional spaces carry their own weight too. Corridors, staircases, courtyards, they all function as liminal zones where tension builds between major beats. In these spaces, characters hesitate before entering a room, exchange glances without speaking, or overhear fragments of conversation that shift their understanding of the situation. The filmmakers treat these moments with the same care as the more overtly dramatic scenes, because they understand that atmosphere is built in the in-between spaces as much as in the climaxes. The genius of the film's settings lies in their refusal to feel static. They change with the characters, reflect their inner states, and hold the emotional residue of what has happened there. By the end, you don't just remember the events, you remember the places where they unfolded, and those places feel like characters in their own right. The final shot lingers not on a person but on a landscape, empty yet heavy with meaning, reminding you that while individuals pass through, the world they inhabit carries on, holding their stories in its stones, walls, and open skies. There's something almost magical about peeling back the curtain on a film like this, because the finished product feels so seamless that you'd think it was born fully formed, as if the camera simply wandered into the world and found the story waiting there. But behind that smooth surface lies months of tireless work, unexpected mishaps, late-night problem-solving, and bursts of unplanned joy that became woven into the DNA of the film. The set was not merely a workplace, it was its own small universe, with its rhythms, rituals, tensions, and laughter echoing between takes. The first thing people often remember about this production is the camaraderie. It wasn't the kind of project where actors arrived in separate trailers, emerged only for their scenes, and retreated back into solitude. Here, meals were shared at long wooden tables, whether on location in the dusty outskirts of a rural village or in the cramped catering area tucked behind the soundstage. It was common to see the film's lead actors sitting elbow to elbow with background performers, chatting about childhood memories, politics, or the day's shoot. That intimacy bled into the performances. You can feel in the film that the actors trust each other, because they had spent real time breaking bread together. The director was known for being meticulous, yet open to surprise. Every morning began with what the crew affectionately called the walk. Before cameras rolled, he would stroll through the day's location with the cinematographer, production designer, and sometimes a handful of curious actors, testing how the sunlight fell through the windows or where shadows might pool as the day wore on. But he also had a knack for spotting serendipity. One overcast morning, just as the team was setting up a complicated dialogue scene, a sudden breeze sent a string of prayer flags fluttering wildly in the background. Instead of stopping to reset, he leaned into it, whispering to the camera operator, "Follow the wind, make it part of the shot." That moment, entirely unplanned, became one of the film's most memorable visual beats. Not all surprises were as gentle. Midway through shooting, the crew faced a logistical nightmare. A key location, an old government building scheduled for demolition, was abruptly closed off by local authorities due to safety concerns. This location was supposed to house 3 pivotal scenes, and rescheduling wasn't an option because of the tight production calendar. For a tense 48 hours, the team scrambled, scouting replacement sites while rewriting blocking to fit the new architecture. The replacement ended up being a semi-abandoned railway office, a place the production designer had dismissed early on as too sterile. But with a bit of creative dressing, dusting the walls with powdered charcoal, scattering aged paperwork, and rearranging the lighting, it transformed into something atmospheric and haunting. Ironically, many crew members later agreed it was more visually striking than the original location. Some challenges were purely environmental. Filming in the countryside meant wrestling with unpredictable weather. Scenes scheduled for golden afternoon light sometimes had to be shot under heavy gray skies, while carefully planned rain sequences were delayed because the real rain refused to cooperate. The solution often came from the practical effects team, who rigged up a rain machine using a network of hoses and recycled water tanks, creating the perfect illusion of a downpour. But the real fun came when one of the actors decided to run through the artificial rain between takes, laughing like a child, soaking himself completely just to lighten the mood. His antics drew the entire crew out from under the tents, and for a few minutes, the set looked less like a film production and more like a festival. The costume department also faced their share of unexpected hurdles. Wardrobe continuity was a daily battle, especially during sequences that spanned multiple shooting days. More than once, the continuity supervisor had to dig through dozens of near-identical shirts to find the one that matched a faint, barely visible coffee stain from the previous day's shot. On one occasion, an extra wore the wrong belt, a minor detail no one noticed until the director, reviewing the day's footage late at night, spotted it instantly. Rather than reshoot the entire sequence, the editing team cleverly masked the mistake with tighter cuts, a testament to the collaboration and quick thinking that defined the production. The crew's bond was strengthened by the small rituals that emerged during filming. The sound team kept a jar of colorful candies by their mixing station, a place where cast members would wander over during breaks to snag a handful and chat. The camera crew had an unspoken competition to see who could pull off the smoothest handheld shot on uneven terrain, and the winner earned the dubious honor of wearing a bright scarf for the next shooting day. Even the catering team became part of the lore, known for sneaking in traditional local snacks after particularly grueling sequences, a quiet reminder that they were all in this together. One of the funniest incidents came during a scene involving a horse-drawn cart. The animal, perfectly trained during rehearsals, suddenly decided mid-take that it had no interest in hitting its mark. Instead of walking down the designated street, it turned sharply and trotted straight into the open doorway of a nearby shop. The startled shopkeeper froze, holding a basket of produce, while the cart's driver desperately tried to coax the horse back outside. Cameras kept rolling, and though the footage was never used in the final cut, it became a favorite blooper reel moment during the wrap party. The director's leadership style was another cornerstone of the behind-the-scenes atmosphere. He believed in running a quiet set, where the hum of activity was constant but never chaotic. Instead of barking orders, he spoke in measured tones, trusting his department heads to manage their teams. This trust trickled down. Lighting assistants would often take initiative to tweak angles or intensities without being asked, knowing the overall vision well enough to make those calls. When mistakes happened, they were treated as learning moments rather than grounds for frustration. Still, there were days when tempers flared. A particularly challenging night shoot stretched into the early hours when an electrical fault knocked out half the lighting grid. For a moment, it felt like the entire day's work might be lost. But instead of packing up, the gaffer and his team worked with the art department to repurpose existing lanterns and practical lights, creating an improvised setup that, remarkably, looked even more atmospheric than the original plan. By dawn, the scene was in the can, and the crew left exhausted but exhilarated by what they'd pulled off together. The actors often spoke about how safe and collaborative the set felt. Emotional scenes were given the space they needed. If someone needed extra time to get into the right headspace, the crew would adjust schedules to accommodate it. This respect went both ways. More than once, an actor stayed on set long after wrapping their own scenes, offering to run lines with someone else or serve as an off-camera presence to help a co-star find the right rhythm. Music even played a role behind the scenes. The sound department kept a portable speaker handy, often playing soft instrumental tracks during setups for emotionally charged scenes, helping everyone sink into the right tone. On lighter days, pop songs from the 80s and 90s would blast between takes, turning camera resets into spontaneous dance breaks. There's a photo somewhere of the lead actor, still in full costume, twirling the boom operator under a tangle of cables, a moment that summed up the spirit of the shoot. By the time production wrapped, the set had taken on the feel of a small, close-knit community. People had celebrated birthdays together, weathered storms both literal and figurative, and built something greater than the sum of its parts. The last day was bittersweet. After the final cut was called, there were hugs, tears, and a long applause that seemed to stretch on as if no one wanted it to end. Props and costumes were packed away, lights dismantled, and locations cleared, but the connections forged in those months of work remained. Looking back, what stands out most isn't just the hard work or the logistical gymnastics, it's the sense of shared ownership. Everyone, from the lead actor to the newest production assistant, could point to some detail in the finished film and say, "I helped make that happen." And in a way, you can feel it in every frame, the texture of real collaboration, the fingerprints of dozens of creative minds, and the echo of laughter and whispered problem-solving behind the scenes. It's that invisible layer, built in the quiet moments between takes, that gives the film its soul. Themes and symbolism in this film weave together so subtly that they don't announce themselves in grand, heavy-handed gestures. They breathe beneath the surface, in quiet glances, in the way a room is lit, or in the silence that hangs just a beat too long between two characters. You don't realize it at first because the narrative is propulsive, drawing you into its world of shifting loyalties, personal reckonings, and historical shadows. But somewhere along the way, you start to feel it, the sense that every scene is carrying two conversations. One in the spoken words, and another in the language of unspoken truths. At its heart, the film is about identity. Not identity in the modern, simplified sense of a label or a singular truth, but identity as a living, mutable thing, an accumulation of choices, regrets, and compromises that shape who we are in ways we rarely acknowledge. The protagonist's journey unfolds like a layered portrait, each brushstroke revealing a self that is both shaped by personal agency and cornered by the pressures of family, society, and history. The way this theme plays out is almost architectural. Early scenes place the character in open spaces, framing them against vast landscapes or wide city streets, yet the blocking often subtly hems them in, with fences, shadows, or bustling crowds, reminding us that freedom is more perception than reality. The passage of time is another major thread, and it's handled with a kind of melancholic elegance. The film doesn't treat time as a backdrop, it's a character in its own right. We watch as years and sometimes decades slip by, and with each shift the world seems to tilt just slightly. The costumes grow worn, the colors in the cinematography become warmer or more desaturated, and even the actor's body language evolves. Spines curve a little more, smiles take longer to emerge, eyes carry a quiet weight. Time here is not just about aging, it's about the inevitability of change, and the way personal narratives are rewritten by the simple fact of survival. War and conflict hum in the background like an unrelenting bass note. This isn't a war film in the conventional sense. It's not about battles fought in trenches or armies clashing on fields, but the long shadow of political unrest, of generational struggle, informs everything. It's in the way characters hesitate before speaking their minds, in the coded language they use, in the mistrust that lingers even in moments of tenderness. The director uses subtle visual cues to underline this. Flags that fade in the background, gunmetal grays seeping into the color palette, and the sound of distant marching or unrest bleeding faintly into otherwise quiet scenes. War here is less about the noise of violence and more about the silence it leaves behind. Then there's the theme of legacy, what we inherit and what we choose to pass on. It manifests most poignantly in the relationships between parents and children, mentors and proteges. The film seems to suggest that legacy is both a gift and a curse. It can be a source of pride, but also a chain that binds. Symbolically, the filmmakers lean heavily on objects to convey this idea. A pocket watch passed down through generations, a family home that seems to grow heavier with history, even the way certain characters wear clothes that belong to someone else. These items are never treated as simple props. They carry the weight of memory, and when they change hands, it's never just about utility. It's about what they represent in the continuum of the family's story. Loss threads through the narrative like a vein of iron, hard, cold, and inescapable, but the film's treatment of loss is nuanced. It's not always loud and dramatic. Often it's quiet, creeping in through absence. An empty chair at the dinner table, a coat hanging untouched by the door. The symbolism of these absences is devastating because it mirrors real life, how the things left behind can sometimes feel louder than the people who own them. The cinematography reinforces this theme by lingering just a little too long on empty spaces after a character has exited, letting the audience feel the echo of what's no longer there. Even the weather seems symbolic. Sunshine is rare and fleeting in the film, and when it does appear, it's often during moments of temporary reprieve, moments that feel too fragile to last. Rain, on the other hand, is abundant, sometimes torrential, sometimes barely a mist. It's as if the world itself is in mourning, or in the process of washing itself clean, though whether it's cleansing or erasing is left deliberately ambiguous. The rain becomes almost a silent character, marking transitions in the plot or shifts in emotional tone. One of the most striking symbols in the film is the recurring motif of birds. Sometimes they're glimpsed in the distance, silhouetted against the dawn, and sometimes they're confined, kept in cages, their wings clipped. Early in the story, the caged birds mirror the characters' constrained lives, their inability to fully take flight. But as the narrative unfolds, the symbolism shifts. we begin to see birds soaring overhead at moments when a character makes a decisive choice, as though the act of agency sends ripples outward into the natural world. It's a subtle but powerful thread that rewards attentive viewing. Silence itself functions as a symbolic device. The absence of sound isn't just a break in dialogue, it's a statement. Long, unbroken silences occur during moments of confrontation or realization, and they force both the characters and the audience to sit with discomfort. It's in these silences that the film speaks the loudest, saying things that no line of dialogue could capture. The sound design amplifies this by stripping away ambient noise, leaving only the faint hum of the environment, a clock ticking, a distant dog barking, to remind us that life goes on even in moments of personal crisis. The color palette also plays an essential role in the thematic architecture. Early scenes are painted with brighter, more vibrant tones, evoking a sense of possibility, even naivety. As the story deepens and conflicts mount, those colors begin to drain away, replaced by muted earth tones and shadows. By the time we reach the latter stages, the visual world feels weathered and worn, as though the film itself has aged alongside its characters. This slow bleed of color is more than an aesthetic choice. It's a visual metaphor for the erosion of innocence and the weight of accumulated choices. There's also an undercurrent of moral ambiguity running through the story. Few characters are wholly virtuous or wholly corrupt. Instead, they exist in shades of gray, making decisions that are understandable but not always admirable. This theme is mirrored in the use of lighting. Often, characters are shown in partial shadow, half their face illuminated while the other half disappears into darkness. It's a reminder that no one is entirely one thing or another, and that the human capacity for contradiction is both fascinating and unsettling. Water imagery recurs in a way that's both literal and metaphorical. Characters are often shown near rivers, lakes, or the ocean, and these bodies of water seem to stand in for the idea of transition, crossing a threshold, leaving one life behind for another. Sometimes the water is calm, reflecting the sky like a mirror. Other times it's turbulent, churning with unseen currents. In one particularly symbolic scene, a character stands ankle-deep in the tide, the waves pulling at their feet as if to suggest the inevitability of being swept into the flow of time. Memory plays a dual role in the film, as both comfort and prison. Flashbacks are woven into the narrative not as straightforward expository devices, but as fragmented, impressionistic glimpses, often distorted or incomplete. The framing of these scenes is telling. The edges blur, the light shifts unnaturally, and the camera lingers on seemingly trivial details, like the movement of a hand or the pattern of wallpaper. It's as if the act of remembering is itself unreliable, yet still powerful enough to shape present decisions. Even architecture in the film carries symbolic weight. Narrow hallways, towering staircases, and labyrinthine corridors are not just physical spaces, they're psychological landscapes. Characters often seem small against these imposing structures, as if dwarfed by the weight of the past or the scale of the challenges ahead. In contrast, open outdoor spaces are filmed in wide shots that suggest possibility, but they're often empty or windswept, hinting that freedom can be as isolating as confinement. At the emotional core of all these themes is the question of resilience. The story is filled with moments where characters are knocked down, sometimes literally, sometimes figuratively, and must decide whether to get back up. Resilience here isn't portrayed as a triumphant Hollywood-style comeback. It's quieter, messier, sometimes even grudging. It's the act of moving forward without certainty, of making peace with the fact that some wounds never fully heal. This idea is echoed in the smallest details: a repaired piece of furniture, a mended shirt, a plant that stubbornly grows between cracks in the pavement. Taken together, these themes and symbols create a dense, interlocking framework that enriches the narrative beyond its surface plot. They give the story a texture that lingers long after the credits roll, inviting multiple interpretations and rewarding rewatching. They also ensure that the film resonates on an emotional frequency that's hard to pin down in words. It's felt more than it's understood, experienced more than it's analyzed. And perhaps that's the ultimate strength of the work. It trusts the audience to see beyond what's shown, to read between the lines, and to find in its symbols not just the story of its characters, but reflections of our own lives. The conclusion for a film like this can't simply be a neat tying of threads, because the story itself resists such simplicity. From the moment we began this exploration, it was clear that the film operates on multiple levels: narrative, thematic, symbolic, and each one is layered deeply enough to sustain hours of discussion. What started as a journey into a historical epic or sprawling personal drama turned into something far more intricate, a meditation on identity, legacy, resilience, and the enduring weight of time. We walked through its story as if following the winding path of a river, sometimes calm, sometimes turbulent, always carrying with it the sediment of human experience. The plot unfolded with deliberate pacing, immersing us in decades of change, the shifting landscapes of political unrest, and the intimate, often fragile connections between people. We've seen the central character navigate a life marked by constant tension between personal desires and larger forces beyond their control. And we've felt, along with them, the sting of sacrifice, the quiet ache of missed opportunities, and the occasional fleeting moments of grace. Our character analysis peeled back the surface of archetypes and revealed something far richer. These were not one-dimensional heroes and villains, but flawed, multifaceted human beings caught in the current